Where's the information on to?
And you have 10 minutes. So there will be a bell at 5, but you can continue. We just need a little bit of time at the end to ask any questions we might have. So, welcome. You're welcome to start whenever you're ready.
Thanks. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings everyone, and thank you for the opportunity that I have to speak to my submission. I'd also like to acknowledge the people that I work with. I'm a counsellor at Te Rangi Te Oranga Trust, also known as Hawke's Bay Gambling Services. And in terms of transparency, I also want to acknowledge that my family, that we receive as part of our community involvement and volunteer work, that we receive funds via that to support the work that we do in the community. So I kind of sit on both sides of the fence. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the people that I work with in my mahi, the people I've worked with before, the people I work with now, and the people that I'll work with in the future that are impacted by the pokies in our community. Both the gamblers and the whānau affected. The ripple effect is quite huge. So, as I said, my family receives and continues to receive proceeds from grants through a long history of community involvement. This is where a huge part of the dilemma we face today stems from. This is ultimately a moral issue, not just a number crunching exercise. This is people's lives. Yes, the proceeds can support community and also take away from the community. Is where the money coming from going back to those, particularly those that can least afford to lose, which they will and which they do. More and more so as the pokies are seen as an opportunity to make money, or people are offered money to put in the machine for a variety of reasons, and the jackpot is struck. If it is struck once, it can happen again, and then the trap of chasing the jackpot, until the jackpot is not enough and it becomes time in front of the machines. Both the sinking lid and non-relocation of machines is a harm minimisation strategy. The machines are not going away anytime soon, and as their numbers decrease slowly over time, new avenues of income will be created, or those receiving the grants will adapt. And I also want to acknowledge that there are people out there earning their livelihood from this source of income. So they will be impacted also. And as I said, it's going to be a long journey. It's not going to happen overnight. I'm not anti-gambling. My concern is harm experienced from gambling, both gamblers and family affected. What do people affected by somebody's gambling look like? I mean, that's a thought. How would you recognise someone in the community that's affected by somebody's gambling? I see and hear people that feel helpless in their own situation and inability to change someone who is caught in the trap of addiction. Their frustration and inability to understand why it isn't easy to just stop, which is what people are told and what people hear. Psychoeducation around the neuroscience and the effect that this has on the individual from the machines can bring understanding, but does not change their situation. What does a person experiencing gambling harm look like? How would you know someone in the street that you walk past who's experiencing harm from gambling? Unlike drugs and alcohol, there are no behaviours that would indicate they are under the influence of an addiction. No blood tests, no breakdown in organs. What does ultimately manifest is impaired mental health and psychosomatic symptoms. Often people don't associate what they're experiencing mentally, physically and emotionally with their gambling. They think it's something else. Most often people present at our service because of a crisis. Debt collectors facing eviction, breakdown in relationships, employment is impacted because of stress leaking out, crime, debt which is relative to each person. So an example I can share, not someone who was engaged with the service, so there's no confidentiality breach here. I was doing the rounds where we engaged with the venues, and I was waiting to speak to a staff member in my work clothes, and there was a lady there, and I said, oh, well, you know, serve her first. So she went up and she asked for $20 out of FPOS, declined. She asked for $15, declined. She asked for $10, declined, and she got $6. So she took 3 $2 coins and walked into the pokie room. And that's in a venue when I'm dressed like this. So people say, well, you know, what's $6? Obviously that's her last $6, and she didn't even know how much money she had left.
Oh, yeah.
And how many times had she gone up to withdraw funds before I happened to walk in there. So that happens all the time. And for me, I think that was one of the biggest eye-openers I ever had. And the person, you know, just paid out and off she went, like it just happens all the time. So that's one example of me actually seeing it in action. So in terms of the gambling, particularly the pokies, and I've got these statistics from Abacus. They do all our gambling training. So over 96.3% of people with problem gambling will have some other mental health issue. Māori and Pacific adults are about 3.5 times more likely to be problem gamblers. 20% of problem gamblers will attempt to end their own lives. Suicide attempts are 7 times more likely when someone is a problem gambler. So in terms of coexisting disorders and mental health, depression, the general population in a lifetime, 8.3% of people may experience depression. With problem gambling, it's 49.6%. Anxiety, general population, 14.6%. Problem gamblers in a lifetime, 41.3%. Drug abuse or dependence, 6%. Problem gambling, 38%. Alcohol, general, 13.5%. Problem gambling, 73%. So it tells you that it just doesn't exist in isolation. There are other things that go with it. On reading other things, I've come up with some things that I thought were myths that people hear, or words that people use. So people say that playing the pokies is safe. So I looked up the definition of safe. The definition of safe is free from risk, danger, harm, or damage. One example quoted was a place being a safe haven. So are pokie rooms a safe haven? And if so, are people safe from who or what? Why are they there? Fun. It'll be fun, they said. Here's some money, and it is fun until it's not. That's another thing that I hear from people. Recreational. Definition, refreshment of the mind, body or spirit through play and relaxation. Yes, playing pokies can be that. However, the numbing of emotions and or avoiding life, I don't think is refreshing. One of the myths I've heard in my understanding, in the mahi that I do, that if we take away the pokie machines, people will just switch to online. Well, in my experience, I've worked with people who tried online, particularly during COVID. However, it didn't work for them. Clients repaid debt and saved money. People have a drug of choice, whether that be alcohol, cannabis, meth, etc. Gambling's not dissimilar. There may be more than one mode, however, there will be a predominant one. And for most people that I strike, it's the pokies. Family harm. There's a correlation with gambling and family harm. People come home, where's the food? Well, unfortunately, the money got spent on the pokies. People getting evicted. The children that are impacted. We hear about poverty in New Zealand. When you look at how much is spent, that's got to come from somewhere. Crime. Whether it be from the proceeds of crime. The TAB have recently come out with something in terms of, I'm just speaking off my head now, I haven't written this down, money laundering. So the other thing is how much, I was told not to speak about this, but anyway I will, how much of the money's going into the machine is from the proceeds of crime, as a way of putting money through, or there's a lot of disposable income which supports the ability for people to pass money on to gamble. And the number of times I've heard someone say, oh, here's $20, just come in with me, and they strike the jackpot. And that's it, literally one jackpot. And they talk about, is that 10 minutes?
Yeah. Shall I open up for some questions from councillors? We may not have any questions from the councillor.
I'll chuck one in just for fun.
Councillor McGrath.
I've heard today a couple of times that gambling machines are not fun. It hasn't been my personal experience or people I know. Do some people have fun?
As I said, we're concerned about the people that don't have fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and there are quite a few of them. I don't discount that there's people that have fun and can manage, but then there's certainly a proportion of people who can't. And as I mentioned before about disposable income, people may have a disposable income where it is fun, but when you've only got $6 left, yeah, that's not fun.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much for coming and taking the time to submit to us today,
Thank
Sharon.
you.
Much
Thank
appreciated.
you.
Thank you.
Got someone on Zoom earlier. Tanya? Welcome. Is this Tanya?
Yes, hello. This is Tanya from NZCT.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us slightly earlier than originally scheduled. So you have 10 minutes for your presentation. A bell will go, which I'm hoping you'll hear, will go off at 5. You can continue a little bit longer than that. We do just like to have a couple of minutes at the end to ask any questions. So you're welcome to start whenever you're ready.
Sure thing, thank you. I'll just see if I can share my screen. I've got some slides.
Oh, it's not behind.
Is that, yeah, can you see that your end?
We can, yes, thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So yeah, I'm just going to run through the main points of my written submission, which hopefully you've all got a copy of.
We have, yes.
Okay, so just a bit of background for you about how things went down last year with COVID-19. Before COVID hit back last March, what you may not be aware of is that Class 4 societies like NZCT, Pod Charity Line Foundation, were all unable to hold cash reserves. So what that meant was that as soon as COVID hit and we went into lockdown, all our venues shut, which meant that we had no income stream. And the first thing we had to do basically was turn down all the grants we'd had applications for that month. And that carried on through April, May, June, and it wasn't until July last year that we were actually able to start awarding grants again. Because we basically had to hang on to all the money that we had so that we could just keep paying our staff. So that significantly impacted the sector during lockdown, and also that's had a knock-on impact to grants. So just to give an idea of the scale of the impact of that on NZCT, we gave grants in the order of $29.4 million last year. It still sounds like a lot of money, but previous year it's been $55 million. So that's the impact that it had on us. Funds distribution to the community probably will still be reduced for some time to come because we still need to cope with that financial knock-on effect. As far as your policy is concerned, our position is that we would like you to retain the cap at 320, which is option 1. And that would just allow for just a very small amount of growth, but most importantly for the sustainability of the fundraising infrastructure, which is the machines that we have in our pubs there. We'd also like you to retain the current relocation provision because that's fair and equitable for our business owners if they have to move business due to reasons beyond their control. We don't think that the current statistical analysis for Napier or the problem gambling situation there justifies a sinking lid. The vast majority of people we know do play for entertainment, and they do know when to stop, and they are having fun, as was mentioned earlier. There is, we know that there's a small proportion of people who are affected by problem gambling, but we don't think that justifies taking the blunt instrument of a sinking lid and applying that to your policy. Just a little bit more on sinking lids. We believe they're ineffective in reducing gambling harm because of this graph that you can see here. The bars are the number of gaming machines, which have been in New Zealand since 2003, and you can see that there's been a steady decline since that year when the Problem Gambling Act was introduced. We're now down to below 15,000 machines from a high of over 25,000. But that orange line across the bottom, that shows the problem gambling rate, which has basically always been the same. Depending on quite which study and which method was used, the numbers vary ever so slightly, but they've always been around that sort of 0.5% mark. And currently, according to the National Gambling Study, that it's 0.2% of adult gamblers. So that's the number of people that have pokies is probably about 7,500 people across the whole of New Zealand. Data from the Ministry of Health shows that Napier has only 1.7% of New Zealand's problem gamblers overall. Auckland has 45%, as a matter of interest. So as for the money that's been coming back, the last year that we have a full calendar year's worth of data for is 2019, and the GMP, which is gaming machine proceeds generated in Napier for that year, was just a shade over $20 million. The return to Napier from all Class 4 sources, so pubs, clubs and TAB, not casinos, was $8.6 million, and that was 42.7% of that $20.1 million. The legal minimum return is 40%, so Napier is definitely getting its fair share of money coming back to you. Just as by way of contrast, Ministry of Health data again shows that in the year ended June 2018, which is the most recent year of data, there were 21 new problem gambling clients in the whole of Napier. Our sector is heavily regulated by the government, the DIA in particular. We have a strongly controlled gaming environment, and if you want to see the detail of what our venues have to do and what we have to do as a society, that's detailed on page 14 of our written submission. Online gambling was mentioned earlier. We are concerned about online gambling. It is growing at a rate of between 12 and 20%, we have been told. And more than $300 million goes offshore every year, which is more than the amount that gets returned to communities from Class 4, which is a means of contrast. And we do think that if people don't come into the controlled environment of the gaming room because gaming rooms have been removed, then we do think that they are more likely to go online because they can do that on their phones in the comfort of their own homes. They don't even have to get out. And problem gambling is much higher. It's 10 times higher in the online environment, and it returns nothing to the New Zealand communities. So that's really all I've got to say. Happy to take any questions from councillors.
All right, I will. Just a question from myself. We had heard from a submitter earlier today who'd done some research around volume of gaming machines across different TLAs in the country. And we currently have one of the higher rates per capita of gaming machines with what we actually have at the moment, which is less than our current cap of 320. So interested to hear your thoughts on that, with you seeking us to retain the existing cap, which would put us, I think, well above a number of other TLAs throughout the country on a per capita basis.
Yeah, it's a little bit more than the research would suggest that it's a bit more complicated than just numbers of gaming machines that's important to the problem gambling rate. What the research that's been done, and this was the whole reason why the government required TLAs to consider a relocation clause in their policy, is because it's actually the distance from the walking distance from where somebody lives to the nearest gaming machines that has more of an influence on whether they'll become a gambler than the actual number of machines in the vicinity. So think it's my understanding that in Napier, pretty much all the gaming rooms are concentrated in the CBD. That would imply that there's a lower risk of, I think, just one out in the suburbs, I think, which would imply that the clustering the machines together in the CBD is actually a good strategy for reducing problem gambling, because you're keeping them all in that one area. So just the pure number of gaming machines is not necessarily indicative.
Thank you. I'll just open up to other councillors if there's any questions. Deputy Mayor Brosnan.
Thank you for your submission. I'm interested in the return of gaming money. We've heard a lot about that from the community as well. Are you able to give us a spectrum of, say, where in your organisation where the highest returns go as well?
Generally, when you mean in terms of the size of the grant?
I mean in terms of possibly another city that I acknowledge the 40% is kind of the benchmark set by government around minimum returns. What would be the highest return to a community, and what determines that return? So is that a decision at a board level, or the number of applications received, or how does that work?
It's all of those things. Obviously, the areas where we have more gaming machines, we have bigger funds. So we're particularly dominant in Taranaki, for example, and Bay of Plenty. But it is that percentage return. It partly depends how much our venues are bringing in. It depends how many applications we get from that area. It just depends on a whole number of factors. Those decisions are made by our trustees, and they do always try to return that 40% across all of the regions as far as possible. It's not always possible in some regions because our venues are just not generating that much money. But like I say, it's for us in Napier, it's definitely at least 40% each year.
Thank you. Through you, Your Worship, can I ask one further question? The sinking lid is obviously something that we're hearing a lot as well through our submissions, and I'm just interested in your view as an organisation. You know, we've seen across the country, Wellington, Auckland, Christchurch, Tauranga, etc., adopt these sinking lid policies. What does that mean from your perspective for the future of the industry if we're seeing our large cities take those approaches?
Yeah, it's worrying for us because, like most gaming trusts, we have probably the bulk of our machines in the bigger centres. And back sort of when it was back in 2003, when there were the 25,000 machines that you saw on my graph, there was excess sort of supply over demand at that time. But as the numbers have gradually come down, we've basically got to a point now where there's sort of an equilibrium between the number of people who want to play and the number of machines that are available. So we've sort of kind of reached a bit of a sweet spot. If sinking lids are brought in a lot of these places, then that basically means every time a venue shuts, those gaming machines are lost. So you're going to gradually erode that infrastructure, and it's a bit like sort of, cutting into the muscle, is a phrase I often hear, where you're sort of starting to lose that infrastructure. So yeah, we are concerned about those policies, because once those machines are gone, they're going to be gone for good unless those councils change the policies again. Of course, then that means over time there'll be less and less money that we'll have available to give back to the community.
Thank you.
Councillor Tapani.
Thank you. Through your worship, this is a follow-on question really from the Deputy Mayors. In your submission, it speaks of the purpose of pub gambling sector is to raise funds for the community, and that message has come through pretty clear. But the end of that paragraph is that it is crucial that this funding system is sustainable long-term, which sort of feeds off the Deputy Mayor's question. We've heard evidence in submission today, and we'll hear it probably tomorrow, that we've got an increasing number of people participating in gambling broadly or nationally. We've not seen any significant shift in a drop in revenue nationally. In fact, that's increasing. But we are getting information around the levels of harm and some confusion around the links between gambling in all of its forms and the harms within our community. Our decision is around the Class 4 machines. And so I'm sort of picking up in the background here that the continued and sustained presence of pokie machines in our communities is seen as a bedrock sustainable activity for the long-term plans of the community trust. Am I where does my thinking sit with yours?
Okay, well, there's a few things in there which we probably just need to look at a little bit. The expenditure on gaming machines is actually not increasing. When you, yes, the raw figure is going up every year. However, what that doesn't take account of is population growth. Basically, since 2004, the population's gone from 4 million to 5 million in New Zealand, and it's quite substantially above that now because of all the people that have come home as a result of COVID. So you've literally got more people gambling now because there's just more people in the country. There's also, you've got to take account of inflation and other economic factors. So when you put all of those things into the pure expenditure figure that you get from DIA, then you would find that actually expenditure on pokies is decreasing. So, and that's in line with the fact that there's a sort of a natural attrition rate in the number of machines at venues across the country, and has been, for the last 15 years. So, I actually don't think it's fair to say that, that it appears that, it's sustainable at the moment, because it's really not. And, we are very aware of the fact that we are, in effect, in a sunset industry, and probably in 10 years or so, we're going to have to look for other funding sources. I mean, our trustees are even talking about it now. So, yeah, that's where things are at as far as we can see.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time today, Tanya. Much appreciated.
No problem.
Thank you. We're still scheduled for Patrick at 2:50? Yep. Okay. So I will move us to agenda item 2. We have 15 minutes. So this, of course, is around the psychoactive substance policy. And I'd just invite Rachel, if you wanted to. Yeah, thank you. And of course, Councillor Price and Councillor Crown may participate in this agenda item, as you don't have a conflict of interest for this one. Thank you, Rachel.
All right, so taking heads out of gambling for a moment and moving into the location of approved psychoactive product sales points policy. So within this policy review, you're now at a stage where you deliberate and decide on this policy for Napier for the next 5 years. And to get to this stage, you have already considered this matter in workshops. You've considered a proposed policy for consultation in both committee and council meetings, and you've undertaken consultation with the public on the proposed changes for your policy from 18th of January to the 17th of February. And out of this consultation, 12 submissions were received, 8 in support and 4 not in support with the proposed policy. So the proposed policy sought really to strengthen the purpose and clause relating to the distance required from sensitive communities to ensure that the exposure to harm from these products is minimised across all vulnerable and sensitive sections of the community. One submission was received from the Hawke's Bay District Health Board for Council to consider including a definition for the term vulnerable. And in considering this, my view is that the changes proposed in the policy are deliberate to give you greater subjective decision-making for council when you're considering vulnerability, not in specific terms of a defined meaning, but really in terms of the context in which you might apply the policy and how communities or vulnerable communities might present themselves in the future. So retaining the subjective ability for you to apply your policy, I think, is important to how this policy may protect our communities in the future. So as you know, Council doesn't have a role in licensing or enforcing psychoactive substances under the Act, but Council's role is, if it wishes to do so, have a policy that places geographical restrictions on where these products can be sold. And as you know, there are no products approved for sale in New Zealand. However, this policy is important to protect our community should that situation change in the future. So I leave it to you to discuss and make your decision. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. Does anyone have any questions? Councillor Simpson.
Is there scope, when we look at vulnerable communities, is there scope to also incorporate vulnerable environments, like public reserves where children might play, or environments like that, or is that out of scope as far as the regulations?
I absolutely think that's in scope. I mean, you have the opportunity to decide where these sales points can be located, and it's how you word that. But I think in terms of the wording at the moment being vulnerable and sensitive sections of our community, you could apply it to those, places as well as to people.
Further to that, my recollection is we did actually debate that at one of the earlier meetings and decided that the wording in the policy as it was would cover those reserve spaces, and because it's, very, very valid point. They are.
It's about reinforcing our view on that position for future application.
Yeah, absolutely. Councillor Tapani.
Just by extension from Councillor Simpson's question, is it possible also to include an overlay around, although when these were sold, they were sold through retail outlets, is it possible to also include an overlay around ATMs, access to those types of things, or is it social locations such as community areas and parks?
I think the intent is to protect the community from the harms of these substances, not so much from the availability and the ease of availability, but it's certainly from the harms. But I think you could also consider making it easier to purchase these causes harm to the users, if it's easier to obtain these substances. I think that if you're in a position in the future where you do have a proposal to consider from Ministry of Health, that's at that point that you would look at this policy and you would say, what is vulnerable and what is sensitive about the location of the proposed retail site? Does it have those sorts of characteristics that might cause harm or not, protect our communities from harm? And I think you could consider that into your deliberations when you think about whether you're locating a site.
So no further questions. The officer's recommendation we have before us is to review the Public Commission's on the location of approved psychoactive product sales points policy and determine whether any changes are required to the proposed policy. And B, adopt the location of approved psychoactive product sales points policy as proposed. Based on the submissions received, the majority of which were in support of the policy as put out for consultation, I'm happy to move the motion from the chair if I have a seconder. Councillor Price, I've never seen you move so fast.
Nice.
And speak.
Oh, sorry, did you have a question, Councillor Bogue?
Yes, I just wondered, Rachel, all TLAs will be going through this process of looking at this, reviewing these policies, I assume. And because it's so sort of out of date now, have any of them kind of taken a different approach or let them lapse or lobbied the government about making laws to enable this to happen or not happen? Has there been other approaches, or is this just the standard response?
So this policy is a may adopt, it's not a must adopt, like say the gambling venues policy. So not all territorial authorities have a policy. And I only know of 2 other territorial authorities that I can speak for, and they have rolled over their existing policies.
And I guess speaking in support of the motion, from my perspective, I do see this as being additional protection for us should anything change at that national level. And certainly, you know, we have seen in the past the damage on, you know, our community when there were psychoactive products available for sale, and the locations of those retail outlets and how they impacted on the surrounding community. So this just gives me that additional peace of mind should anything change in the future. Councillor Price, did you wish to speak to the motion?
A bit to say, actually.
Microphone, brother.
I support it, and I think the couple that are against it indicated it's actually for reasons that we can't control. I think they think that we should, the government should get rid of it. We can't do that. And so I think it's pretty clear everybody is on the same wavelength. So I think it's, as the Mayor said, I think it's a protection for us. And I probably wouldn't have said all that if I hadn't have been sitting here all day with nothing to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Price. Did anyone else wish to speak to the motion? Deputy Mayor Brosnan.
Yeah, I'd just like to speak in support. I remember sitting through when we, you know, did all of the work to initially develop this policy, and what I like about where we've got to and what we're proposing to continue is that it really does strike the minimal number of venues in terms of the setbacks we have built into this without stepping over the line in terms of restricting, which we're not allowed to do under the Act, the sale if any were to be approved. So this would allow, I think, a maximum of 2 venues if we were to ever receive you know, the approval, well, if anyone was to receive the approval to sell any. So I think we've kind of struck the right minimum balance for us, and just like to say that I think a huge amount of work went into defining that area in the initial, and I'm really happy to support it carrying over.
Thank you.
While I do support this resolution, I must say that prohibition does not make illicit drugs go away. And since the onset of synthetics in our society, and particularly now that they're not allowed to be approved or sold, has not stopped their proliferation and the damage. People have died from synthetics in our city. So while we may think that we're making people safe, just be aware that there's an undercurrent. Because of prohibition, there's no legal place to buy these things, that the harm has not gone away. It's just gone undercover, and it's increasing, I would say, rather than diminishing. But anyway, I support the resolution.
Thank you, Councillor Bogue. There being no further councillors wishing to speak, I will put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. And we should have our last submitter for our gambling venues policy joining us any moment now. So we'll just take a brief moment of respite, and we will have Patrick Legette from the Hawke's Bay District Health Board join us via Zoom.
That's weak. Are we so far away that they couldn't front?
Same philosophy. No, I did hear right.
Tēnā koutou.
You're our last submitter of the day.
Make it good.
So just to let you know, we do have 3 councillors with us today that have declared a conflict of interest, Councillor Crown, Price and Bogue. So if you're wondering why they're being so quiet, that's why. And you have 10 minutes for your presentation, and of that 10 minutes we would just like a minute or so at the end to ask any questions that we might have, but you're welcome to start whenever you're ready.
Awa tēnā koutou katoa, nā mihi atu ki a koutou. Aku mihi ki te whitirangi Annie Aranui. Moi mai rā, te tuahine, te kai whakahaere o Ministry of Social Development. O mātou whanaunga hoki, nō reira, moi mai. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Patrick Legera hau. Ko te kai whakahaere hauora Māori ki te wāhanga hauora o te mātawa Māori. He tupu ana ahau e te rohe pai o marae nui I ahureri, nō Ngāti Kahu Nunu ahau. My name is Patrick Legere. I grew up in the beautiful city of Ahuriri and Marae Nui, and I hail from Ngāti Kahununu iwi, and my role here is as an acting Executive Director of Health Improvement and Equity, but also my other substantive role as the General Manager of Māori Health. So you would have seen our written submission, and we've been listening to the other submitted today, and the overwhelming majority are heading in the same direction as us, and that we recognise that gambling is a huge issue in Māori and also the burgeoning or growing Pacific community. We recognise Napier as has a substantial Māori population and growing. It has a growing Pacific population, and that gambling is a substantive issue in Māori communities, and that Māori twice as likely as non-Māori to be choosing to gamble with the pokie machines. Our submission is based on the evidence that you all should know, that social deprivation, social harm is more substantive in Māori communities. That Napier City has a high number of gambling machines in comparison per capita, and also by TLA, I think it's the ranks 10th of 67 TLAs of the number of gambling machines that you have, and that gambling addiction, in terms of our local gambling counselling service, just under 50% of those attending those services are Māori people. We understand the sinking lid policy is the preferred approach that we have suggested, and indeed your own Māori Standing Committee suggested that to you, that that's their preferred approach too, and we're somewhat surprised that that wasn't acknowledged, and we stand with them and others in suggesting that that approach should be adopted for consultation with the community. We know that a number of gambling facilities are within high deprived communities or within close proximity to high deprived communities, and so we submit that we support the sinking lid policy approach when it comes to gambling machines. That's
Kia
all I
ora.
have to say, really. Yeah,
Kia ora.
you got the written submission.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Patrick. Just a question from myself. It has been suggested that reducing the volume of gaming machines does not actually have any impact or correlation to reduced spend. So just wanting to hear your thoughts on that.
Reduce spend in what sense? The consumer spend or the...
The amount of money being actually spent on gaming machines, put into gaming machines, doesn't actually reduce with a reduced volume of machines available in the community?
Yeah, I haven't seen that evidence, so I can't really respond to that. But where there's availability of gambling machines to a high-need community, obviously there's going to be more opportunity to gamble.
Yeah, absolutely, and not disagreeing with that at all.
Yeah. So and Napier, we're the 10th highest TLA of 67 in the country with in terms of number of gambling machines. So there's a proliferant amount of gambling machines available to a community that's prone to social harm.
I'll just open up to the other councillors in case they have any questions as well. Bearing in mind, you're probably, as the last submitter, most questions have already been asked throughout the day, so you're probably going to get off quite lightly. And it would appear that that is the case. So thank you, Patrick, for joining us today and for your written submission. Your time is much appreciated.
Awa, tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi atu kia koutou.
Kia ora. As I said, we do have an afternoon tea break scheduled for 20 minutes. And has there been food organised? Yeah. I mean, I'm quite happy if there's not.
Yeah.
I was going to say, if there's not food organised, we'd just carry on going.
Bring it in here.
Yeah, actually, if you want to grab a hot drink and we'll just come in and get straight into it. Yeah.